So today I want to talk about the Parable of the Sower and its sequel, Parable of the Talents, the two books that are published in the Earthseed series, all by Octavia E. Butler. This is an unfinished series, but a powerful one that I just finished. And it is crazy to see how closely Octavia E. Butler in some ways predicted what is happening right now in 2024, where the first book is set. And this is one that was just such a powerful read, and I can't wait to share it more with all of you. I realize it's an older book and some of you might have already read it or at least are aware of it, but if you haven't read it yet, I really hope you stick around. I'm going to be talking more about my experience reading it and whether or not you should try it for yourself. If that all sounds good, let's get started. So first, let's talk about what the series is about, starting with the fact that it follows a young woman who is living with her family in her present day, which is 2024. And so it was very interesting to see how the author predicted this current year that I'm recording this video in, how it was going to go in her imagined future. Now, I do want to recognize before I get too far into this video that the book was published in 1993, which was several years ago, more than 2 decades. However, I do want to acknowledge that that is not relatively that far away, and you could argue that a science fiction writer today could pretty reasonably predict some of the things that will happen perhaps in the next 20 years after that. And so I don't want to get too into the woods of saying that this book is incredible in terms of its prophecies, but it is quite surprising in some of the directions that this book and series took that really do ring true to the 2020s in general and specifically to our modern day. And so in this book, we follow this young woman and you find out that this future that I imagined is somewhat post-apocalyptic. Now, I'm hesitant to use that word because usually when we associate something as being post-apocalyptic, we imagine a nuclear wasteland or something incredibly dramatic. Instead, this is a lighter version of that, where it imagines a world that has been radically changed by climate change. So we have seen an uptake in the number of weather events and the severity that is happening, which again feels very reminiscent of what we're seeing in our real world right now. And also a lot of changes in terms of political changes and getting more severe in terms of political alignments. We're seeing a collapse and downward spiral of our economy, and so we have more people in poverty. We see more crime because of that. There's a huge component of economic inflation, and so because of that we are seeing food prices skyrocket, which again feels way too familiar here. And then we also have a lot of the subsequent rollouts of things that happen along the way when all of these terrible events start to domino effect. And so we have situations where characters of people in this world are dying of diseases that otherwise should be curable. They are not able to get vaccinations because either they're not available or they can't afford them. There is a breakdown of our education system, and we're seeing the political environment where this story is set at the beginning in America really being divided. You have those that are looking to find a new solution, feeling like this is the breaking point for humanity, for America, and where they need to go and change. And then we're also seeing an understandable desire from another portion of the country that are really looking to get back to the good old days. And there is a lot of political drumming that is going on and getting back to the good old days of America. And so without getting too far down the rabbit hole of current American politics, you can probably guess from that brief synopsis that this book is very much reflective of the strong division we are seeing in American politics right now. We have some very strong leaders in different roles that have very strong specific opinions on how the country should be run, and we're seeing the country itself divided, the desire to return back to traditional roles, to traditional ways, to get America great again and all of that. And it is strange how closely Octavia E. Butler was able to predict some of the divide that would really rip apart the country. In the later book, The Parable of the Talents, that one leans a bit more into the dystopian aspects. It's hard to describe it too much, but certainly you have the apocalyptic downfall of the world itself, but then you also have these political regimes that are becoming more powerful, more influential, and having a stronger influence over how our day-to-day lives are being run and how much is being controlled by government policy. And so it's a strange book that really walks the line between multiple different genres. And while it is also science fiction, there's also this element of fantasy, because you find out that the main character, when she was in the womb of her mother took these drugs, and these drugs caused her daughter to have this syndrome which causes her to appear to experience the pain and pleasure of other people. and so it makes her hyper empathetic. Now, this is explained through more of a scientific way, so it's not meant to be seen as fantastical. The general synopsis, as we come to understand, is that she imagines this, and that is more in her head. It's more of a psychological syndrome rather than something like telekinesis. But regardless, to this main character, the pain that she feels is very, very real. And again, she also can feel pleasure, but because of the state of the world, there is a lot more pain to be felt than pleasure. And so she has this very debilitating condition where she is taking on these emotions and having that very much impact her life. And because of the empathy that she is forced to take on, whether or not she likes it, it very much shapes her outlook, her view of the world around it, and what she feels is right for the future of America, for the future of humanity, and how we must work together in certain ways in order to overcome what she perceives to be coming in the future, or has perhaps already happened given the state of our world. So if you can't tell from that synopsis, this book is going to be touching on a lot of hot button issues. So we'll be addressing straight up climate change, which is always controversial when I mention it on my channel. It also is going to be heavy-handed when it comes to politics, and certainly the author does have a certain political view. This author does lean left, so keep that in mind depending on your own personal feelings about reading books that involve politics. I personally like to read books that include these aspects. I recognize not everyone does, but I do think there is value often of choosing to read books that actually challenge our opinions, something that might be adverse to what we normally think, and really make us think about things differently. So if you are open to reading a book that is very politically heavy, but has some really interesting nuanced messaging around it, I think that there is a lot of value to be found here. For me, this book hit home in the fact that the author chose to imagine a future that felt very real and very possible. And I think, again, in the last couple years, this book has really risen in popularity because of the fact that it really is very telegraphic of the different world events we're seeing right now. And I think it's the fact that the author really looked at some of the social economic policies that were happening, looking at what we value as different North American cultures, and extrapolating that into a near future. I think what really works with this book is the fact that the author chose to write in a way that certainly is stark and hard to fathom. It is dark and depressing and paints a very bleak future for the 1990s when she was writing this. However, I think that this book is so impactful because of the fact that it's not overly exaggerated. In a lot of ways it feels very possible, and I think that's why this book again has gained so much popularity, is people are seeing the fact that food prices are increasing, that we are seeing more weather events, and there's so much in terms of the small details of this book that have come true. And really it comes down to the fact that the author was seeing things that were already happening 2 decades ago and extrapolated them and continued to see that onward trajectory and take the story there without getting too far-flung and too imaginative. Now, certainly, as I mentioned, there are some creative liberties thrown in there. I wasn't originally sure how I felt about the one character's ability to have this empathy, but I felt like one small element that felt a bit fantastical was still again so grounded in reality and explained away in a way that didn't feel like the author was trying to make me believe in magic. So I think the author did enough to keep it grounded. There are no aliens. The technology has not really surpassed too far what we have right now because of the fact that naturally things have, if anything, regressed due to that economic collapse. And so this world of this future in some ways feels more like the world of our past, and I think it's an interesting conversation. This book, in terms of the first book, Parable of the Sower, was such a powerful read. I gave it 4.5 stars rounded up on Goodreads, and I would highly recommend it to most people who are interested in this book. Again, I think your mileage might vary depending on your interest in reading books that involve a lot of these hot button issues and where you fall in some of the political spectrums, but again, I think it's good to challenge ourselves in different ways. And instead, what I would encourage people to do is just simply make sure they are waiting until they're in a good mental space in order to read this book. I had this book on my radar for the last several years, but in the middle of 2020 and even 2021, I did not feel like reading about the end of the world, and I'm really glad I didn't, because I think I would have had a vastly different experience with this book. It is one that is very dark, terrible things happen, and you are watching the world in this state. Certainly the author offers glimmers of hope, but it's a book to read when you're in the place that you can handle that. Now to move on to the second book, The Parable of the Talents, I promise not to talk direct spoilers, but just to give you an idea of what to expect if you continue on to the second book. This one is generally a direct sequel. It will follow along the events of the first book. This one I liked a lot less than the first. So the first book was generally an almost 5-star read for me. This one was more of 4 stars. I liked a lot of it. I found the narrative to be a little bit less focused, and what it did focus on was a bit less interesting. While the first book is more about the world collapse, and again, more talking about the environment and the economic situation and the health situation and crime, the second book is much more heavily focused on the dystopian situation that is going on as a certain government regime gains power. And I think that while it is certainly a powerful message in terms of some of the things that are happening with American politics in the last couple of years, it wasn't entirely the focus that I found to be the most compelling, simply because the author had to kind of take more leaps and bounds to project into a future, and it felt like the author had to do a little bit more exaggeration in order to get her point across. The second book is also more focused on religion and the communities that different religions will attract, and this is really my biggest struggle with the second book, is mostly the fact that it deals heavily with religious factions and communities, and I didn't necessarily love some of the messaging that was being brought across. I felt like the author was assuming the readers would naturally be very attached to a certain sect and a certain way of thinking, and I didn't necessarily get along with the characters and their motivations and values in the way that I think the author expected me to, so it was a little bit of a disconnect. And so there's a lot of kind of misses with the second book in a way that it just wasn't the home run the first book was. That being said, if you love the first book, absolutely continue on. It just wasn't as great of an experience for me. It wasn't as perfect, but still a fantastic read, still something I would recommend. It just never quite hit the perfect highs of the first book, which again was depressing. It was a dark book, but it hit me in such an emotional way, in a way that the second book didn't quite get there. And finally, I mentioned the fact that this is a series that is unfinished, which always brings up the question for readers about whether or not it is still worth reading a series that will not have a satisfying ending or conclusion in any which way. This book series has 2 books that are published, and my understanding is there was several more books that were plotted to eventually come to light, but the author passed away before that could happen. So this book series does leave it unfinished, but I would argue that the nature of a series like this works well when it comes to being unfinished, because the future is not written. This author is speculating about what will happen in the coming years from the present time of 2024 and onwards. And so with each book, they imagine further and further into the future, speculating in ways that we will advance and move and shift. And I actually think it's almost a bit poetic that it's unfinished, because again, our future is not written. And so the fact is that we don't have a conclusion. We don't know how everything is going to wrap up. And so I actually think that it works better than other series would to leave it open like this. The last book is a stopping point, so I don't think it's horrific to end there. There's no character that is falling off a cliff in the last chapter that is going to drive you nuts to never know the ending for all of time. Keep in mind that I'm also a reader who prefers the journey over the destination, because I enjoy the experience even if I never get a solid ending. If you are someone who needs a conclusion in order to enjoy a story, this one might be less satisfying, but I would argue that even if you just read the first book, it very much could have been read as a standalone. I think it holds up especially well, and again, because the second book is a little bit weaker in my opinion, I do think you can get away with just reading that. If you really want to have a strong stopping point, again, the second book is still another stopping point, and we just never get to see where the author takes it from there. But I kind of enjoy imagining and questioning where the author would take this. I would love to know whether or not they were planning to have an optimistic, hopeful ending to the series, or were they planning on having it end in a dark and dreary way. I certainly have my guesses and muses based off of what I know of the author, the themes that she was exploring in this book, and where this possibly could have gone. And I kind of like that, because for me, in some ways, I'm thinking about the series more because it is left up to us as the reader to imagine an ending for it and to fill in those blanks. And I actually find that more enjoyable, because sometimes authors give us very definitive endings to their stories. And if I don't like that ending, I feel like they have just shut the book on their story, and I don't have the opportunity to mull it over, to imagine other options, other endings, and instead I like the fact that there is opportunities here to imagine the different ways that this story could come together or completely just burn humanity to the end. And I'm just left thinking about where it could have possibly gone, and I'm okay with never knowing. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know what you think of the series. If you've read it, do you love it as much as I do? If you disagree with any of my comments or feedback on it, love to hear that too. If you haven't read the series, I'd love to know if I convinced you to read it, or maybe based off your own reading taste, you've decided to give this one a hard pass. I'd love to know if you're not gonna read it, why is that? And again, let's discuss that all below in the comments. If you're new to my channel, hopefully you stick around and subscribe. I do read and review a lot of science fiction as well as fantasy, horror, thrillers, and other dark things. If you want to help me out with this video, please give it a thumbs up, drop a comment, even if it's just an emoji, like an Earthseed. I don't know if there's emojis for that. Let's find out. And then from there, if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.